Hi guys, it's Ms. Flates again. I'm back with another lecture and another guided notes for you guys to fill out as I'm lecturing. So far we've talked about the rise of dictators, how they came to power in Europe. Then we talked about appeasement and how these world leaders were trying to appease Hitler so we wouldn't start another war. Obviously, they couldn't appease Hitler enough. He invaded Poland, and this directly created another world war. So before we really get into talking about the battles, we're going to talk about the rise of the Allies. So these are specific men, world leaders, army generals that really made a big difference in World War II. So when we do talk about the battles, you'll be able to associate these men and these generals with the battles that we're talking about. So here we go. All right, first we're going to talk about the two powers, the two sides of the war that we had. First, we had the Allied powers. So we have Great Britain, we have France. They're the original two countries that are fighting against Germany at the time, right? Germany invading Poland, that was a direct hit against what Great Britain and France said at the Munich conference, right? The United States joins later. Similar to World War I, and I'll talk about how the United States joins, and also the Soviet Union. So something interesting about the Soviet Union that I will come back to in a second. The Axis powers, we have Germany, Italy, and Japan. So Germany and Italy, we know, are both fascist. We know that Hitler and Benito Mussolini are best friends. Japan had a similar government to Germany and Italy, where they were very militaristic. They were focused on nationalism, winning through violence, through fear, through forced military power. And Hitler really had a lot of respect for the leaders in Japan and the way that they ran their country. And Hitler even once said, oh, you know, Japan, they're a different form of Aryan race, so they're okay. Even though they're Asian and come from a totally different DNA, he liked the way that the Japanese government ran and had that militaristic, nationalist mindset that he's like, you know what, they're okay with me. So originally, if you remember the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, the Soviet Union was part of the Axis powers, and they did have an alliance with Germany in the beginning of World War II. Eventually, what I'm going to talk about really tomorrow, Hitler broke that non-aggression pact. I talked about that a little bit in that first slide, but when Hitler broke the non-aggression pact he had with the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union actually switched to the Allied powers. So they were originally on Germany's side, but since Hitler basically betrayed the Soviet Union switched to the Allied powers. And thank God that the Soviet Union did switch over, because they're really one of the main reasons that the Allied powers won. And we'll talk about why. All right, something else that can get a little bit confusing with World War II is that there are two fronts, or two theaters is another way that you can say. There's a European front, or a European theater, and then there's the Pacific front, a Pacific theater. You could say that there are really two different wars going on at the same time, and a lot of times people just mix them all together, okay? So first we're going to focus on the European front. What was the cause? We know the cause was Hitler breaking the Treaty of Versailles, breaking appeasement and invading Poland. And this is originally Germany versus Britain and France. And then Germany gained some people and countries to be on their side. Great Britain and France gained some people to be on their side. This is the US involvement. This is the Soviet Union involvement. And this happens in Europe, okay? Our next PowerPoint, when I talk about the battles, I'm only going to talk about battles on the European theater, okay? Then I'm going to do another PowerPoint about the Pacific theater, or the Pacific front. Now, the Pacific front had totally different causes. It really didn't have anything to do with Hitler, didn't have anything to do with the Holocaust. This was really just between the United States and Japan. Really, the only reason why the United States got involved on the European front is because they're such close allies with Great Britain. The reason that the United States got involved on the Pacific front is really their own fault. And I'm going to go into a lot more detail about this when I do my PowerPoint about battles in the Pacific. But the main thing that happened was the United States cuts off Japanese oil supply. I'll explain why when we talk about our battles, but this obviously pissed off Japan that the United States was doing this. So how does Japan respond? They bomb a US military base, which is Pearl Harbor, which you've probably heard of before. So now the United States is really fighting two wars. They're helping their friends in Europe defeat Germany, and then they're really fighting their own war that they caused on their own in the Pacific and Japan, okay? So just have that mindset as we go through the rest of this chapter. I'll have one PowerPoint about the battles in Europe and then one PowerPoint about the battles in the Pacific. Okay, the first ally we're going to talk about is FDR. We all know that he's a president, right? We know that he's in a wheelchair. He had polio. Also, his wife was his cousin, which is weird. Here's FDR and Winston Churchill talking. We talked about Winston Churchill for a little. All right, so FDR supported England through the Lend-Lease Act prior to entering World War II. So I mentioned this before, where the United States does not want to get involved in any of these wars, World War I or World War II, until the very last minute, right? They're far away, they're not near Europe, they don't want to be involved, so they usually don't get involved till the very last minute. So instead of just sending our troops to Europe right away, FDR said, we are still going to support our allies through this Lend-Lease Act. We're not going to send our men and our armies, but we will send military aid, we'll send weapons, we'll send clothes, food, ammunition to Great Britain and to our allies. We're going to lend these military aids and these weapons to Great Britain and to France. We'll lease them out type of thing, okay? So there are no US soldiers in World War I in World War II for the first couple of years. They're just lending out military aid as their support because they don't want to be involved. Now, obviously, Germany is fighting Great Britain and France, and Germany's getting upset that the United States is just sending them all this money, sending them all these weapons, all this food, all this artillery. And Germany, Hitler's kind of like, well, if you're going to send Great Britain and France all these supplies, then you say you're not involved, but you really are involved, right? And I mean, I could understand why Germany was upset. So eventually, this is why Germany declares war on the United States, and the United States is officially involved in World War II. Germany says, you can't just send my enemy aid and help them out and say you're not involved, like you are involved. So the United States officially gets itself wrapped up in the European theater. All right, so then the United States also has the Pacific theater to worry about, right? Like I said, they cut off Japanese oil supply, and we're going to talk about those reasonings once we talk about the battles in the Pacific theater. But since the United States cut off the Japanese oil supply, Japan responds and bombs Pearl Harbor. The United States is officially at war with Japan. After Pearl Harbor, FDR supervised transition to a wartime economy because they're also fighting a war on two fronts. They have soldiers being shipped off to Europe. They have soldiers being shipped off to the Pacific. He is active in planning the Allied war strategy against Germany and Japan. We know that the president is the commander-in-chief of the military, right? So like I said, the United States is officially in two wars with two different fronts. And this will make a lot more sense once we talk about our battles. All right, the next ally we're going to talk about is General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He's an American. He led successful invasions in North Africa and Italy, and as I said in my next PowerPoint, when I talk about all the different battles in the European and Pacific front, you'll be able to identify which general led these invasions and these battles that we've been talking about. He was named the Supreme Commander of all Allied forces in Europe. So think about all the different infantries, all the different stations all throughout Europe. Germany, France, England, North Africa. He was the supreme commander of every Allied force all throughout Europe. That's a lot of responsibility. He's like the head of the head of the head, the number one guy on top. He looks over every single operation that's all across Europe. Obviously a very intelligent man. He planned and led the Allied invasion of France, Operation Overlord, or also known as D-Day. Some of you might have heard of the D-Day invasion before, or the invasion of Normandy. It's probably one of the most famous battles or invasions of World War II, and we're going to talk about it a lot in our next chapter, or our next PowerPoint. But he planned and led one of the biggest invasions in World War II. He's the supreme commander of all Allied forces in Europe, and he became one of the presidents of the United States. He was our 34th president. He became president in 1953 to 1961, so he served 2 terms. There he is right in the middle. There he is planning the D-Day invasion. What a guy. So he said, "I hate war as only a soldier who has lived it can, only as one who has seen its brutality, its futility, and stupidity." So he obviously didn't like war, but he was good at strategizing, and he wanted to end this war as quickly as possible, probably why his strategies worked so well, right? But if you just look at the greatness of this man, he led one of the biggest invasions in not even World War II history, but one of the biggest and greatest invasions of all time. He was the supreme commander of the entire European front. And then after that, like he hasn't already accomplished so much, he goes on and becomes president of the United States. And one of the best presidents that we've ever had. In the 1950s to 1960s, it was the biggest peacetime in the United States. Everybody loved him. Those of you who took civics when you were in middle school and you looked at campaign slogans, he had the first commercial that was on TV for presidents, and it was that one. It was like, "I like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike," because Ike is short for Dwight. Anyways, that was him. Really incredible, intelligent, accomplished man. All right, next guy we're going to talk about is General George S. Patton. He's another American. He led Operation Torch and the invasion of North Africa, which we're going to talk about those more in our next PowerPoint. He commanded the U.S. Third Army after the Normandy invasion also known as D-Day. He inspired his tired troops to victories across France and into Nazi Germany. So he was mainly in France throughout Europe, and as we're going to learn as we talk more and more about these battles, is that really all of France becomes occupied by Nazi Germany. And a lot of people fighting in France wanted to give up, and he was really there to inspire and say, we can't give up. Even though all of France is controlled by Nazi Germany, we can still move on, which they were able to. Here's a picture of him. This was at the end of the war. One of his quotes, "Battle is the most magnificent competition in which a human being can indulge. It brings out all that is best. It removes all that is base. All men are afraid in battle. The coward is the one who lets his fear overcome his sense of duty. Duty is the essence of manhood." Now, I know in the other PowerPoint that I did, I had you guys analyze their quotes. I'm not having you do that just yet in the guided notes because I'm going to have you guys answer a final question at the end that you can analyze these quotes in. All right, next we have General Douglas MacArthur. This is another American. The difference with General Douglas MacArthur is he was a general in the Pacific Front. So Patton and Dwight Eisenhower were in the European theater. Douglas MacArthur was in the Pacific theater. Supreme Commander of U.S. forces in the Pacific. So he's basically Dwight Eisenhower in the Pacific. So every battle, every army, every infantry that was throughout the Pacific, Japan, the Philippines, New Guinea, wherever they were, he was in charge of everything that happened. Okay, very, very powerful, top of the top for the Pacific theater. Forced to flee the Philippines after Japan attacked, and we're going to talk about all the battles in Japan. The battles that we talk about in the Pacific theater really have a very different vibe than the battles in the European theater. It's a different form of fighting. Japan has a different culture than Europe does, so it'll be interesting to compare the differences in the battles. Led U.S. forces through New Guinea and back to the Philippines. accepted and signs Japan's official surrender in September 1945. This is major, okay, because the war in the European theater ended before the war in the Pacific theater. So when Japan officially surrendered, and we have a lot to talk about before we get here, he was the one who accepted the surrender and signed it. That's a lot of responsibility, that's a lot of power. I also think he kind of looks like Bruce Willis, the actor. No, I just really think he looks like him. So here is FDR looking at some planes in the Pacific. We see Japan over here, right? The soldier above all others prays for peace, for it is the soldier who must suffer and bear the deepest wounds and scars of war. That is a quote from General MacArthur. Winston Churchill, we talked about him a little bit, right? Prime Minister of England. He warned about Nazi Germany prior to World War II. We talked about this with appeasement. He was wiser than everybody else. He knew this was going to happen. He's been planning for this. He became England's prime minister after Neville Chamberlain resigned in 1940. We talked about that. Refused any armistice with Nazi Germany, so any type of truce, because he knew that Hitler was somebody that couldn't be trusted. He knew that if Nazi Germany wanted to come and say, oh, we want a truce, we want to make an alliance, we want to sign some type of pact like Nazi did with the Soviet Union, he was a little smarter than Joseph Stalin, and he knew how Hitler could be conniving and manipulative and refuse. I mean, that did make Hitler retaliate more on England, but Winston Churchill was just a little wiser and knew the true motives of Hitler. His speeches and broadcasts inspired the British people, and really the British people went through a really crazy invasion that we're going to talk about tomorrow. And with his guidance and leadership, Great Britain probably wouldn't have survived without his guidance and leadership. All right, next guy we have Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. So he is the first non-American military man that we're talking about. He commanded the British 8th Army. So far all the Allied soldiers we've talked about have been American. He commanded the British 8th Army, led forces through North Africa. We're going to talk a lot about North Africa tomorrow. Led the Allied invasion in Sicily and Italy against Benito Mussolini. Was command of Allied ground forces for D-Day. So D-Day we had sea invasion, land invasion, and he was in command of the ground forces. Again, D-Day was one of the most significant invasions of the entire war, and the fact that he was a part of it, also being led by Dwight Eisenhower, it's very significant and powerful. There he is, telling some people what to do. All right, Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle was a Frenchman, commanded the French Armored Division against Nazi Germany. Now, really, if you're looking at a map, which you all should know what the European map looks like, France is really on the front lines in World War I and in World War II. France always gets hit the hardest because usually everything does come from Germany. I mean, we didn't blame Germany for no reason, and France usually suffers the most. Refused to accept France's surrender and led to the Free French government in exile. So again, what we're going to talk about more tomorrow, but I talked about a little bit today, is that really all of France becomes part of Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany really starts taking over all of Europe, and all of France really becomes engulfed by Nazi Germany. He refused to accept France's surrender and refused to stop fighting against Nazi Germany, even though they were technically under Nazi Germany control. Commanded the French resistance from England and North Africa. I'll let you guys read this. You can just pause it and read it on your own, but basically this poster is saying exactly what I just said, how France is really being controlled by Nazi Germany. That'll make more sense when we talk about it tomorrow, and that we have to continue to fight. You know, this is really a message that Charles de Gaulle wanted to get to the people of France, saying don't give up, I know we're being controlled by this fascist, evil man. We haven't even talked about things in the Holocaust that he's done. We've only talked about wars and battles so far. But don't let it get to you. We're going to keep fighting on. Vive la France, long live France, all that stuff. France always suffers the most. They really do. Besides the Jews. All right, so in this picture, we have another French general. We have FDR, Charles de Gaulle smoking the cigarette, and then Winston Churchill all in a conference together. What are we going to do? We have Charles de Gaulle on the right, and then we have Winston Churchill. All right, so we had a quick PowerPoint today. The last thing that I want you to do as an exit ticket on your guided notes, based on what you learned about these leaders' personalities and characteristics, which one do you think you would most want to serve with, work for, or learn from? Explain your reasons for making your selection. So I want you to analyze their accomplishments. I want you to analyze their quotes and what they said about war and how they viewed war and how they viewed their time serving in this war. And which one would you most want to serve for, work with, okay? And just explain that in your guided notes. Just use information from the PowerPoint. And then next time I talk to you guys, we'll be talking about some battles on the European front. All right, make sure you turn in your guided notes. Good job, guys.